right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So, Jazakallah khair, Sharif, for joining me today. We wanted to go through some different translations, Sharif and I, and to talk about some of the differences and where those differences might come from, questions that people might have around those differences, and kind of see how we can take benefit from using multiple translations and seeing the different perspectives and contexts from which the translators came and how that can be seen through the different translations. So inshallah, really looking forward to this. If this goes well, we'll do more, inshallah. Today we're going to be starting with Surah Al-Fatiha, and we have chosen, what is it, 7 different translations to go through today. So Sharif, anything you would like to introduce before we jump in here?
No, let's just cut straight to it.
Okay, let's go straight into it. All right. So starting with Surah Al-Fatiha, we're starting with the Bismillah, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We've chosen Mustafa Khattab, Sahih International, Abdul Halim, Pickthall, Yusuf Ali, and then Hilali and Khan. And we also have Muhammad Asad here, which is another important one we wanted to incorporate. All right, so please, Sharif, let's start.
Sure. Well, when it comes to Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, there are a number of things which present, I guess, challenges for the translator, how to convey the meanings that are in the verse. I think the one that stands out the most is probably Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim.
Mm-hmm.
Both of these mean the merciful, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
or the one who's caring and compassionate and merciful.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not necessarily identical in meaning.
Mm-hmm.
They come from the same root, meaning mercy, and yet they have different nuances or connotations.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does one go about differentiating them or conveying those nuances in English translation? It's very interesting to see how different translators go about that.
Yeah, having that same root, the Rahamim, the root for mercy, both of them being adjective patterns, right? Ism sifa, means that they both express the idea of mercy. And then how do you use the idea of mercy along with the different tafsirs to create that meaning? The other one I would like to point to also is the word Allah, translating the word Allah, right? Most translators have said Allah. However, Abdul Halim puts God, and Muhammad Asad also puts God. So shall we start with that one? Shall we start with Allah and God?
Sure. So God is a perfectly appropriate translation for Allah. Allah in Arabic connotes God, the supreme deity, the supreme being that created everything. And it most likely comes from Al-Ilah, meaning the God, or the thing that is worshipped or worthy of worship. And English basically accomplishes the same thing as the definite article in Allah as Al-Ilah by capitalizing the G in God. So that distinguishes God with a capital G from any other God with a lowercase g. And so God is a quite apt translation for Allah.
Yeah, great. One thing which I think the word Allah, if you take it, there's the two schools. One school says that Allah is the original word with no root.
Right.
And the other one says it comes from the root alaha, or the same root as ilah, which is from la ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah. And I was actually recently talking about the word Allah and the root hamza lam ha alaha. And it's interesting that you're able to go into the meaning of what a God is and what the language considers God to be.
Mhm.
And so it's the meanings of, one of the meanings of it is to adore. So the one who you adore, the one you serve, the one that you worship, of course, ibadah, and ibadah being the combination of adoration and service and so on and so on. So there's value in the word Allah, I feel, if you go back to that root. But to the reader, Abdul Halim, I'm sure when he's translating it, he wants to make it easy for his audience, because they're not going into the root and they're not going into all of that, and they're just reading it maybe for the first time.
Right. Also, perhaps not all non-Muslim readers would be aware that Allah and God are equivalent to each other. So in that case, using God, which may be more familiar, might have certain advantage. But on the other hand, other translators may wish to familiarize the reader to the Arabic name Allah. So that's
Yeah.
where sort of your priorities could influence which translation choice you make. And both are perfectly valid.
And both are great. And I think it just gives you that perspective. It's not really either or. I know a lot of times we like to think in what is the correct way to do something. But really, both of them highlight different priorities, like you said. Appreciate it. All right. I also noticed that Sahih International and Hilali and Khan, they put the extension, the diacritic mark for Allah, that it should be stretched, and these two, I would say, are the more literal ones in that way, in the closer to the Arabic.
Yeah.
So they're really about getting it, technically right, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good observation. I didn't really take notice of that.
And I think that speaks to their priority of, like, Sahih International, when I read it, outside of even just this verse, it matches the Arabic word for word a lot of times, where in English, usually it might make more sense to flip the words around in order for them to read better.
Yeah.
But they don't pay attention. They don't care about that. They care about the order in the Arabic is almost maintained.
Right. Yeah, as we're going to see, there's kind of a spectrum of translations when it comes to Sahih International and Khan and Hilali, often on one side, trying to give the most literal rendering in English, and not necessarily the most elegant English idiom. Whereas Abdul Halim and Asad might be on the other side, more concerned with conveying the meanings of Arabic, not so much in a literal way, but more in a way that fits English idiom.
Yeah, and it's not that it's more correct. It's more technically correct to the Arabic. If Arabic is your priority, then it's more technically correct for the Arabic as a priority. But if your priority is the readability in English, then more correct is a different thing, right?
Right.
Which you've alluded to. Appreciate it. So going to the next word, which is Ar-Rahman. So we have the most compassionate. So the idea of the superlative, the most. We have the entirely merciful, so all-encompassing kind of mercy. The Lord of mercy, the beneficent, which is, the meaning is closer to generous, isn't it? For beneficent, like generous in good. Most gracious, and again, most gracious for Hilali and Khan. What would you put these shades of meaning in? Asad, what does Asad have? Asad has also the most gracious.
Yeah. So first of all, many of these translations, they kind of just give a plain use of two different synonyms, compassionate, merciful, or beneficent, merciful, gracious, merciful. But in the Arabic, it's different, because the same root is used rather than two entirely different words, but the difference in meaning is suggested by maybe the pattern of the word, or other sort of other information that that gives meaning to these two terms. So if you look in the Quran, Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, and also the classical Arabic language, what sticks out between these two terms is that if you look at Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim in the classical Arabic language and in the Quran, first of all, Ar-Rahman is used only for God. It's a very exclusively divine title, whereas Ar-Rahim, a person can be described as being Rahim.
Like the Prophet is
right.
Ra'uf or Rahim.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the ordinary sort of word for merciful. So some scholars try to differentiate these two terms by looking at the form, the morphological form, Ar-Rahman being on the form of Fa'lan and Ar-Rahim being on the form of Fa'il. So Fa'il would connote someone having an inherent quality of mercy, but not necessarily expressing it at the given moment. Whereas Ar-Rahman could be seen as the actual extremely intensive mercy at a given time. But I think a more convincing approach is to actually just look at how the Quran uses each of these terms. And I've done that just for my own self. And I found that Ar-Rahman is consistently used in the Quran in reference to God's universal mercies as a creator. Mercies that are provided to all believers and unbelievers, righteous and unrighteous, and to all of creation. Whereas Ar-Rahim is used in contexts where it highlights God's special mercies to his faithful servants. Mercies such as guidance, special help, delivery from some kind of harm or punishment, also forgiveness, these kinds of things. So also
the way I like to kind of match that with the Arabic is that fa'lan, if it's representing the intensity or the depth with which the mercy is throughout, like you said, universally throughout creation. Whereas for Rahim, I've seen the Mufassirun say that it is the mercy that Allah gives to the believers, right? Based on Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran. And for me, that's if you were to put it on a timeline, right? Rahim is the idea of Allah being merciful in the dunya and in the hereafter. And in the hereafter, that's for the faithful believers, right? Whereas in this world, it's for everyone. And so you have Rahman, which is the depth of that, the intensity of that mercy, regardless of what the reciprocation might be. Whereas Rahim being that, like you said, that special mercy, and it's more over that kind of timeline perspective.
Sure. Another thing about Ar-Rahman is it actually comes from Old South Arabian. It's actually not originally from classical Arabic. So that might be another reason why focusing on the form in classical Arabic might not give necessarily an accurate insight into the meaning.
Just by itself.
Right.
I remember we talked about it also being used in Hebrew, Rahman. And
yeah, a similar form.
Yeah, and it being kind of used by Christians in the Yemen, and so having that be something which is used to talk to the Christians in the case of Surah Maryam, where that's where the word Ar-Rahman is used most frequently.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
The way I personally like to go about translating these two terms is to use mercy in both of them, but use some kind of adjective to give a sense of the differences. So Ar-Rahman I might translate as the all-merciful, to emphasize the universality of that mercy. And Ar-Rahim I might translate as maybe the ever-merciful, to emphasize the fact that this represents an inherent and constant quality of God. And you can see some translators, they did something similar. So Sahih International has the entirely merciful for Ar-Rahman and the especially merciful for Ar-Rahim.
For the special.
I quite like Abdul Khalim, the Lord of Mercy, for Ar-Rahman, because as I've mentioned, Ar-Rahman is a title exclusively for God. So calling him the Lord of Mercy kind of highlights that exclusiveness to God.
And where would you say the giver of mercy? Where would you say that comes from?
The giver of mercy. That I'm not entirely sure why he translates it that way. Maybe because he has in mind God's giving special mercies to his faithful servants, but that could also apply to Ar-Rahman, God giving mercy universally. So I'm not sure why.
It seems like Muhammad Asad also went in a similar kind of style, the dispenser of grace, the act of giving that. And I suppose that reminds me of the especially merciful, because you're choosing who to give it to you in that way. You know, if you take it to be that a special mercy. Okay. Jazakallah khair, very good. And where would you say the difference is between the merciful versus most merciful using the superlative?
Yeah, good point. So in the Arabic, you have the definite article al, which you would translate as the. So the merciful would be a more literal translation. But like if you consider the tafsir or the rhetorical sort of implications of the use of that definite article, then it has the idea of God being the most merciful. So going beyond just the grammatical meaning to what is actually being conveyed by
in the context.
The article, right?
The context of mercy. In the context of mercy, God is the most merciful, and that is what the al, which is normally translated as the, that's what it is conveying here.
Right.
Which is what they've several of them used most. Yeah. Okay, beautiful. Let's move on to the next verse. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So starting with Alhamd, which several translate as all praise, and others translate as just praise. So we can speak to that first, and then also Khan and Hilali, praise and thanks. What do you think?
Yeah, so here, the definite article, which connotes, literally it would be the praise, but it means praise as a category. Hence, some translations have praise, just praise, like in the sense of the entire category of praise, whereas others make it more clear by having all praise.
Yeah. So the al lam al jins, right, for the whole genus or the category of praise. Yeah. Great. And then
also, and also you can make a choice as to how much of the nuance of the word hamd you want to include, because hamd is not only praise, but it also includes thanks or gratitude. And so Hilali and Muhsin Khan, they translate it as all the praises and thanks.
That alhamd is thana and shukr. It's the combination of thana and shukr, which is praise and thanks. And they've, you can usually trust them to go with the tafsir and give you the whole thing. For sure. Okay, and then we have Allah, which we've translated, and then we have the word Rabb. Now, Rabb is translated as Lord usually. Yusuf Ali adds cherisher and sustainer, and I believe Asad also uses the word sustainer, which is, if it goes back to Rabb being the Murabbi, being the nurturer, or the one, the sustainer, as it says.
Right. One thing that's quite nice about Asad's translation is that he gives footnotes explaining a lot of his
Mm,
translation choices.
mhm,
And that occurs here with Ar-Rahman and Rahim, I think, also with Rabb.
mhm. Yeah, so he explains, rendered by me as sustainer embraces a wide complex of meanings not easily expressed by a single term in another language, and so on. He talks about the master of the house, Rabb ad-Dar, and so on. Yeah, okay. All right, and then finally we have the word al-alameen. Al-alameen is translated as all worlds or the worlds by many of the translators. Khan and Hilali leave it in Arabic and translate it as mankind, jinn, and all that exists. And Asad keeps it as also the worlds. Anything to add there? I guess it's a definition of the worlds in the tafsir is mankind, jinn kind, angel kind, and everything else.
Right. So with Alameen, you also, the way you interpret the word will also influence your translation. Alam means world, but it has the plural ending in.
Mm,
But what's interesting about this plural ending is it's usually used for personal beings,
mhm,
not just for inanimate sort of beings.
mhm,
So one might translate it as worlds of people, maybe
mhm,
worlds of personal beings, but that's not a very elegant English translation. So all peoples is one way I like to translate it personally. But most translations, they just say Lord of all worlds or Lord of the worlds
mhm,
without really explaining that it's referring especially to personal beings, with the
mhm,
exception of Hilali and Khan, where they give a parenthetical explanation.
mhm,
Mankind, jinn, and all that exists.
mhm. And I would say that, in it could be inclusive of both animates and inanimates, the sound plural. Could it not? Because if you have, I mean, there's examples of these words being used, like sound plurals being used with 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 inanimates.
Right. So that's not necessarily a definitive argument. One could
Mhm,
simply translate it as all worlds
mhm.
without narrowing it down to personal
Yeah,
beings.
yeah. And I remember I was always. It was interesting when we were studying Arabic class. We were studying about animates and inanimates, and how the feminine is used for the inanimates, and then um, when Ibrahim is talking to the idolaters about their idols, then he uses the animate pronoun because that is what they perceive.
Mhm.
That is what they perceive the idols to be when he's calling them out on their perception of the idols. Um, well, anyway, okay. Well, let's move on. So then we have Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, which we covered already. Same translations as before, the most gracious, the most merciful, and so on. Next, we have Maliki Yawmiddin. So Malik, most translated as master of the day of judgment. Sahih International, the sovereign, the only owner and the only ruling judge. Khan and Hilali have it as. And then Asad has it as Lord. Why do you think Sahih International said sovereign as opposed to master?
Well, one thing here is there are two different readings. One is Malik, which is the more common reading in the Muslim world, but the other reading is Malik. Malik,
Mm,
the first of those means owner, whereas Malik means king.
mhm,
Um, so which reading one goes with might influence one's translation. I think most of them probably go with Malik just because that's the more common
mhm,
one.
mhm,
But some translations, they might be an attempt to sort of compromise between the two or
mhm,
try to incorporate both of those. So sovereign perhaps is meant to include both meanings, owner or master on the one hand and king on the other.
mhm. And that's what Hilali and Khan are doing. They're putting both of them, the owner and the judge.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing Malik and Malik together. Again, they don't leave one stone unturned compared to the other translators. Then we have the translation of ad-din as judgment and as recompense. Deen, which we know normally when we say the word deen, we think of religion, but it comes from it originally comes from dayanun, dain, which is debt, right? The obligation, the debt that one owes, and it's with that where the idea of that word meaning recompense comes from, or judgment comes from. Any thoughts on that? I suppose it's straightforward. Maybe they chose recompense to differentiate from judgment, al-qiyamah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because ad-din has the meaning of al-khisab wal-jaza. Hisab would be reckoning or accounting, and jaza would be compensation. So I like recompense because I think it includes more of the meaning of the word, but judgment is also an accurate translation.
Yeah, and that's, I guess that's going back to hisab al jaza, and here from the tafsir, Khan and Hilali, they usually incorporate the tafsir that as you see it. Excellent. All right, the next verse. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. Khattab adds the alone here, even though it's not there in the Arabic, but it's there understood from the balagha and from the taqdeem, which we can talk about. We also see Pickthall using older English with thee and Yusuf Ali. They were known for that. Otherwise, it seems like they have left it pretty similar. Any ideas here?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, first of all, because of the way the sentence is structured, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ instead of نَعْبُدُكَ, وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ instead of نَسْتَعِينُكَ, it implies you are the one we worship, or you are the only one we worship. You are the only one we ask for help. And most translations try to convey that in some way. The only one I think that doesn't is Yusuf Ali in this particular case. Just you or thee do we worship, and thine aid we seek. But there's in the Arabic, there's a strong implication of you alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help.
Yeah, I think Khattab has made it very clear what it is, and the others have left it subtle. Kind of like it is in the Arabic, it's subtle. It doesn't say faqat, or innama, right? It doesn't have a clear word that means only. And they've kind of left it with that capitalizing the Y and saying it is. So they've made it subtle in that way. Whereas Pickthall, Khattab, they've made it very clear. Khan and Hilali, they've made it clear. Great, thank you so much. The next one, Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. Pickthall and Yusuf Ali say, show us, which is interesting. Because show is different from guide. And any thoughts on show versus guide?
Yeah, I guess to show someone the path, you might just point them to the direction, like that's the path, but guide could imply you're actually in front of them, like holding their hand and taking them along the path.
Yeah, I was reading about the damirs here, that usually you would expect with hidayah ila, ihdina ila sirat al-mustaqim. But the removal of the preposition, instead of saying ihdina ila or ihdina ala, then it actually opens up the meaning to all those possibilities. So it could be guide us to the straight path. It could also be guide us along or upon the straight path. Both of those meanings could be included with the omittance of the preposition there, which normally you would expect with this word ihdi, or guide.
Right.
So that being reflected in the translations altogether, both showing and guiding along, guiding to and guiding along. So all three really, showing, guiding to, and then guiding along.
Right.
All of those till the end is there. I would say this is the strongest one because it kind of affirms all of the meanings.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I like the use of along because it's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah. Awesome. Almost we have a few more verses here. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Oh, this is the last verse, but the last verse here. So the path of those who you have blessed, not those you are displeased with or those who are astray. So here we have several sections, and that's what I meant by verses. I meant the sections of it. The path of those who you have blessed. So starting with that, versus the path of those upon whom you have bestowed favor. And this is what I meant when I was talking about Sahih International being very word for word, precisely the Arabic.
Right.
Whereas Khattab or Halim, Abdul Halim, they've kept it short. The path of those who you have blessed. Yusuf and Pickthall doing the Old English, and then Khan and Hilali bestowed your grace. Anything for that first section?
Yeah, what you said is basically what I was going to say. In the Arabic, it reads, the path of those upon whom you have bestowed blessings or upon whom you have bestowed favor. And so some translate it literally that way. And there's an advantage to that because it kind of gives the idea of God on high, sending down blessings and favors to the person who is praying. But if you just want to convey the essence of it in English, you might just simply go with the path of those whom you have blessed, or path of those whom you have favored.
Yeah. So the on whom is removed, or on them has been removed, or at least the ala, I would say, has been removed. The idea of on is removed from some of these, just to make it easier to read. غير المغضوب عليهم, not those you are displeased with. Khatab, again, going with the shorter version. Sahih International going with a longer. Not of those who have earned your anger. Those who incur no anger. That's the shortest rendition. I think Halim is generally, he likes to be short and to the point, from what I've seen. Not the path of those who earn thine anger. Those whose portion is not wrath. That's different. Any ideas on that? Those whose portion. I wonder where he got the word portion from.
I'm not sure. I think it may be more of an older
Poetic
English
license
usage or something. Yeah.
Those whose they don't deserve. They those who deserve, maybe those who deserve.
Yeah. I think it may be in like an older, more archaic way of saying that. Those who deserve wrath.
But he's kind of switched it. He didn't say not those whose portion is wrath. He said those whose portion is not wrath. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think there are like two different ways you could render the Arabic here. One is,
so here, right? Not those who earned your wrath. Not those who earned your wrath. Where he's said not those who did not earn your wrath. which is an interesting way to do it.
Right. But the other way to translate it could be, I think, the path of those whom you have favored, who have not earned your wrath. Could you translate it that way?
Yeah, and I think that's what Halim does as well. Those who incur no anger.
Right.
Which is interesting because there's this adab that we're told to have with Allah, to not ascribe anger to him. That's the adab, and that's the adab in the, which is not in the English a lot of times, but in the Arabic it is. The passive is used. Al-maghdubi alayhim. The passive is used. There is no mention of you are displeased with. There's no mention of you, because the adab with Allah is we don't say you are angry, O Allah, because that's out of respect for Allah, that we don't say that directly. Like Ibrahim, when he says, وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينَ, when I get sick, then he gives me cure. Ibrahim doesn't say when he makes me sick, even though it is Allah by whose permission all of that happens. Does that do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and it also another possible reason is by not making Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the subject, it makes it open. Anger is upon such people, could be from God, but it could also be from other people, could also be from the angels.
Yeah, and that's in the Arabic, you know. It doesn't say anta, ghadibta anta alayhim, you know, ghadibta alayhim, but rather it says al-maghdubi alayhim. And so I actually feel like Halim has done a good job of rendering that in it closer to the original than maybe the ones who were trying to be super literal about it. Because then look, like, so he had to add in your, because otherwise it won't make sense in English.
Right.
Or they feel like it might not be clear. And that does come from the tafsir, I would say. But the original words of the Quran don't have that. So it's an interesting way to go about it. So it's something that you have to balance as the translator, because this loses the meaning of, so here it's, because this is swapping the negation. The negation, it's not saying not those who incur anger, but it's saying those who incur no anger. So there's also, you know, something lost here and something lost there. So really the translator always has to choose, which is part of the reason why we're doing this, is trying to highlight those choices that the translators have to make. And then finally, وَلَضَّالِّينَ, or those who are astray. And I think that's pretty, who have not gone astray. The others look the same. What do you think? Anything to add there?
Right. The only other thing I would add is Hilali and Khan, they explain these two terms. Those who earned your anger, they give a pretty standard interpretation in parentheses. That is, those who knew the truth but did not follow it. And then for the astray, they put in parentheses, those who did not follow the truth out of ignorance and error. I personally would rather relegate that to explanatory footnotes rather than have it directly in the translation. And I think that's why a lot of people feel that Hilali and Khan reads a little bit clunkily. They give a lot of information that would be better off in footnotes. But once again, it's pretty interesting how much they try to pack into their translation of the meanings compared to other translations.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is it for the Fatiha. Really appreciate you joining me today, Ustaz Sharif, and may Allah bless you, bless your family, and Jazakumullah khair. Anything to add before we conclude today?
And you likewise. No, I think this was just one case study to show how different translators go about translating the Quran, and why they make the translation choices they do. and how different choices can reflect different priorities, all of them being valid in their own way. Like none of these translations is wrong. They all just reflect different choices of the translator.
Yeah, exactly. It's not really about wrong or right. It's about the priorities that the translator has set out to and you know, sometimes we have our own preference of what we like. So it's not that it's more correct or wrong, but rather if I wanted to share the Quran with someone, which one would I choose? Depending on who I'm sharing it with.
Right.
You know, if I was reading it for myself, which one would I choose? Like for Arabic students, I always recommend Sahih International because it's very close to the original Arabic. For non-Muslims who are coming to the mosque and are wanting to read the Quran for the first time, we usually have Halim or a Khatab. So it really depends. Pickthall Yusuf Ali, you know, just because of the old English, we no longer, that's not, I mean, even though that was growing up, Yusuf Ali was the most popular and common, but that kind of led to the you know, translation of different translations, because they said, well, this is old English and it's becoming hard to read, and new groups of people have new needs. And Khan and Hilali are kind of approaching it from, well, we don't want people to be misguided as to what the Quran's intent is, and kind of the door for interpretation is not left as open with Hilali and Khan, because they're concerned about that interpretation piece aspect of the Quran itself.
Yeah.
A lot to think about. It was really fun discussing this with you and kind of picking your brain about this and having someone to kind of bounce that off of. Really appreciate your time today, and Jazakallah khair.
Likewise. Wa yakum.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.